Right now, sitting in a hangar somewhere near you, there is a Cirrus SR20 that its owner genuinely loves. Beautiful airplane, Garmin Perspective touch panel, air conditioning, leather interior, full parachute system, low total time on the airframe. The owner bought it 3 years ago, flew it enthusiastically for the first 8 months, and then life did what life does. The trips got shorter, the gaps between flights got longer, the hangar bill kept coming every single month like clockwork, whether the airplane moved or not. And at some point in the last year, the owner started doing the math. Really doing it. Not the math from the purchase brochure, not the numbers the sales rep walked through in the conference room at the Cirrus factory in Duluth, not the estimate they sketched out on a napkin over dinner when the idea of owning their own airplane first got serious. The real math, the full picture, every dollar. That math told a story that nobody in the sales process had actually bothered to tell them completely, and it is exactly the story we are going to tell today. Start to finish, nothing left out. Before we get into it, subscribe right now. Because what I do here is get into the financial reality of aircraft ownership in a way that most content in this space simply does not. Not the dream version, not the brochure version. The actual version, with the actual numbers, so that when you make a decision about whether to buy an airplane, and which one, and when, and how, you are making it with a genuinely complete picture instead of the partial picture that tends to be the one available to buyers who are excited and ready to sign. Hit subscribe, because the next video is just as important as this one, and you do not want to get halfway through a purchase process before you find out what you missed. Now, let us talk about the SR20. The Cirrus SR20 is one of the most thoughtfully designed personal aircraft ever built. I mean that sincerely, and I want to be clear about that before anything else in this video, because nothing I am about to walk through is a criticism of the airplane as an airplane. The Garmin panel is genuinely excellent. The creature comforts are real. The CAP system, the Cirrus airframe parachute system, is a meaningful safety advancement in personal aviation, and the data on it over time has borne that out in ways that matter. The airplane handles beautifully, the training ecosystem around it is well developed, the owner community is large and engaged and genuinely helpful. If you walk into a Cirrus sales event, the experience is polished, the people are knowledgeable, and the airplane they put you in the left seat of absolutely delivers on what it promises in terms of feel and capability. The problem is not the airplane. The problem is the cost structure underneath the airplane, the one that does not show up cleanly in any single line item during the purchase process, the one that gets assembled piece by piece as you move through ownership, and the one that, by the time you are sitting in front of the full picture, often looks meaningfully different from what you thought you were signing up for. That gap between what buyers expect and what ownership actually costs is what this entire video is about, and it is wide enough and specific enough and consistent enough across the SR20 owner population that it deserves its own serious treatment. Let us start with what a new SR20 actually costs to acquire in the current market, because this is where the first disconnect tends to happen. A base SR20 today carries a sticker price in the neighborhood of $500,000, sometimes a bit below, depending on options and model year, sometimes meaningfully above once you start adding things. And you will add things, because almost nobody buys a completely base SR20, and most of the options on the list are genuinely useful. The air conditioning is not a luxury in any serious sense if you are doing summer flying in the South, the Mountain West, really anywhere with warm weather, because a Cirrus cockpit on a hot day without air conditioning is genuinely uncomfortable, and in certain conditions, fatiguing in ways that have safety implications. The Safe Taxi and Synthetic Vision upgrades to the Garmin suite are similarly not frivolous, they are real tools that pilots actually use. The upgraded leather and interior finish matter to the kind of buyer who is spending this much money on an airplane and intends to put clients or family members in the right seat. And the safety-related options, like the enhanced autopilot features, are the kind of thing you feel genuinely good about having if you ever encounter actual instrument conditions. So by the time a buyer has configured the SR20 the way most buyers of this airplane actually configure it, you are frequently looking at a number somewhere in the $550,000 to $650,000 range, depending on exactly what year and package you are looking at, and sometimes beyond that for a fully loaded specification. The dealers are not being deceptive when they walk you through this. The options are genuinely good, but the starting point for your cost calculation needs to be the airplane as you are actually going to buy it, not the base price in the headline, because very few buyers are driving off the lot in the base model. Now let us talk about financing, because most buyers of an airplane at this price point are financing at least a portion of the purchase, and the financing math in the current interest rate environment has changed meaningfully from what it looked like just a few years ago. An aircraft loan on a well-maintained Cirrus from a reputable lender today is going to price at somewhere in the range of 7 to 9%, depending on your credit profile, the age of the aircraft, the loan term, and the lender. That is a genuinely significant interest rate for a depreciating asset at this price level. Run the numbers on a $400,000 loan, which is a fairly typical amount if you put $100,000 to $150,000 down on a $550,000 airplane at 8% over 15 years, and you get to a monthly payment somewhere in the neighborhood of $3,800 to $4,000 just in loan service. That number is before you have paid for a single gallon of fuel, a single hour of mechanic time, a single month of hangar rent, or a single insurance premium, and it is a completely fixed obligation that comes due every month whether you flew 40 hours last month or 0 hours. The reason this matters so much is that buyers frequently calculate affordability against their income and cash flow in a way that treats the airplane as an isolated line item, when in reality it competes directly with every other financial commitment in their life. The same month your airplane loan payment is due, so is your mortgage, your kids' college tuition if that applies, your other vehicles, your other insurance, your other lifestyle costs. A monthly aircraft loan payment of nearly $4,000 is a genuinely significant recurring commitment, and when something in the rest of your financial life tightens unexpectedly, which it does for almost everyone at some point, over a 15-year loan term, that payment does not get flexible. The airplane does not care that you had a slow month or that an unexpected expense hit. The lender's billing cycle is perfectly indifferent to everything else happening in your financial world. So the loan service alone, before anything else, starts your monthly cost picture at somewhere around $4,000 on a financed SR20. Write that number down. We are going to add to it. The next line item is insurance, and this one tends to generate the single biggest gap between what buyers expect and what they actually discover once they actually talk to a broker with their specific pilot profile in front of them. Here is how insurance on a Cirrus tends to go for a buyer who is typical for this airplane. The typical SR20 buyer is not a career pilot. They are a successful professional, a business owner, a doctor, a lawyer, an executive, someone who earned the kind of income that makes a $600,000 airplane a realistic conversation. They often have a private pilot certificate, sometimes an instrument rating, and a total logbook time that is somewhere in the range of 200 to 800 hours, with variable currency depending on how active they have been recently. Some have more time than that, some have less, but this describes the center of the buyer distribution in a meaningful way. For that buyer profile, a hull and liability insurance package on a new SR20 is going to run somewhere in the range of $8,000 to $14,000 annually, and often more than that if the buyer has a private-only certificate, limited recent instrument time, or a relatively low total time. $8,000 to $14,000 a year is $660 to $1,160 per month, every month, added on top of the loan service we already calculated. For buyers with thinner total time or certain certificate limitations, it goes higher. And for buyers who have had any kind of incident in their history, it can go significantly higher or become structurally difficult to obtain at a workable premium. The insurance story gets more nuanced than just the initial premium too, because it tends to evolve over the first few years of ownership in ways that buyers do not always fully anticipate going in. Most underwriters writing a policy on a relatively low-time pilot in a high-value aircraft are going to include what is called a dual instruction requirement, meaning you need a certain number of hours of flight instruction in type before your policy allows you to act as pilot in command solo. Some policies require annual recurrent training, typically a full-day or multi-day simulator and ground event at an approved training center, as a condition of maintaining coverage. Cirrus has its own factory-affiliated training program, and while that program is genuinely excellent and the training itself is valuable, it costs money on top of the insurance premium itself. We are talking anywhere from $1,500 to several $1,000s for a multi-day recurrent training event, depending on where you go and what package you select. And if your policy requires it annually, that becomes a fixed recurring cost that sits on top of the insurance line in your annual budget. So by now, we have monthly loan service of around $4,000 and monthly insurance amortization of somewhere between $700 and $1,200, and the airplane has not moved yet. We are already at roughly $4,800 to $5,200 a month before a single flight. Next is hangar, because a Cirrus SR20 needs to live somewhere. And I want to be clear about something here, which is that while you can technically tie down a Cirrus outside, the combination of the airplane's value, its avionics package, and the practical reality of maintaining a paint job and windshield on a composite airframe means that almost every actual SR20 owner ends up in a hangar. The airplane deserves a hangar. The investment demands a hangar. And a hangar costs real money. Hangar costs vary more by geography than almost any other fixed cost in aircraft ownership, which makes it genuinely hard to give a single number that is accurate everywhere. In a smaller regional airport in a less congested part of the country, you might find a T-hangar for $600 to $800 a month. In a major metropolitan area, particularly on the coasts or in high-demand markets like Texas, Colorado, Florida, or the Pacific Northwest, hangar costs for a single-engine piston can run $1,200, $1,500, even $2,000 or more a month, depending on the specific airport and the availability situation. And hangar availability itself is a problem in a lot of markets right now. Waiting lists at desirable airports are real, sometimes measured in years, not months. And buyers who assume they will easily find a hangar after they close on their airplane sometimes discover that the hangar search is its own months-long project, with its own set of complications. Let us use a conservative middle number here, call it $900 a month for hangar rent, because that is a reasonable estimate for a buyer at a regional airport that is neither exceptionally cheap nor exceptionally expensive. That brings our monthly fixed cost total to somewhere around $5,700 to $6,100 before we have addressed maintenance, fuel, or training. Take a moment with that number. $5,700 a month in fixed costs means that just to have the airplane sit in its hangar, insured and theoretically available to fly, costs roughly $68,000 a year. It has to cost that before you go anywhere. Now let us talk about maintenance, and this is where the Cirrus-specific picture gets genuinely important, because there are things about maintaining a Cirrus that differ meaningfully from what buyers sometimes expect when they come from the used piston world or from research based on older aircraft. Cirrus Aircraft has a service network that is real and well-developed compared to a lot of general aviation manufacturers. There are authorized service centers across the country, and the factory in Duluth backs up its product with a level of support infrastructure that a lot of manufacturers at smaller production volumes simply cannot match. All of that is genuinely true and genuinely valuable. It also means that maintenance work on a Cirrus is predominantly performed by specialized shops with Cirrus-specific training and tooling, and that specialization has a cost that shows up in labor rates and in parts pricing. The annual inspection on an SR20, which is a legal requirement every 12 calendar months regardless of how many hours the airplane flew, is not a quick oil change. A thorough, well-documented annual inspection on a Cirrus, performed by a competent A&P with appropriate Cirrus experience, is going to run somewhere in the range of $2,000 to $4,000 for labor and consumables alone, assuming nothing significant needs to be addressed. That is the cost of a clean annual. The moment you start finding things, which you will, because airplanes are mechanical, and mechanical things wear and break and need attention, the number starts moving. A tire replacement here, a brake service there, a sensor that is reading inconsistently, a landing light assembly that has developed a crack in the housing, a flap motor that is drawing higher amperage than spec. None of those are catastrophic findings. All of them add hundreds to the annual bill on their own, and in any given year, you will have several. Real-world maintenance spending on a well-maintained SR20 across a typical year, including the annual and addressing the squawks that come up through normal flying, runs somewhere in the range of $4,000 to $8,000 annually for a relatively healthy airframe with no major known deferred items. That is a range of $330 to $660 per month in maintenance budgeting, understanding that in some years you will come in below that range and in others you will exceed it meaningfully. Budget somewhere in the middle of that range and you are being realistic without catastrophizing. But here is where the Cirrus maintenance picture has a specific wrinkle that does not apply to older certified airplanes, and it is one that catches buyers by surprise more often than it should. Cirrus aircraft are built on a type certificate that generates a continuous stream of service bulletins and service advisories from the manufacturer. Some of these are optional, some become mandatory through airworthiness directives from the FAA. Some fall into a gray zone, where they are not technically required but where a reasonable owner should probably do them anyway, because they address something real. Managing that bulletin compliance picture, knowing which ones apply to your specific serial number, which ones you have complied with, which ones are on the horizon, is its own ongoing project in SR20 ownership, and it has a direct cost in mechanic time and parts even when each individual item is relatively minor. There is also the matter of the avionics package, because the Garmin Perspective Touch or equivalent suite that makes a Cirrus panel so genuinely impressive is a complex, interconnected system that requires its own ongoing maintenance attention. Database subscriptions are a real and recurring cost, and we will address those separately in a moment. But the avionics hardware itself, the boxes behind the panel, the wiring, the antennas, the sensors, requires periodic inspections and occasional attention when something goes wrong. An avionics repair event on a modern glass panel aircraft, even a relatively minor one like a transponder that fails a certification check, or a data link receiver that stops communicating correctly with the pilot display, can run anywhere from several hundred to several $1,000s depending on what the diagnosis reveals. These events are not monthly occurrences on a healthy airplane, but they happen, and when they do, they are not cheap. So our maintenance budget line, being realistic about all of this, lands around $400 to $500 a month, with the understanding that it will spike in certain months and years. Now let us add fuel, because the airplane actually does need to fly at some point, and flying it costs money in a very direct and variable way. The SR20 is powered by a Continental IO360 engine that burns somewhere in the range of 10 to 11 gallons of avgas per hour in normal cruise operation. At current avgas prices, which vary by region but run somewhere between $6 and $8 per gallon at most airports in the continental United States, with meaningful variation above and below that range, a full hour of flight in a Cirrus SR20 costs roughly $70 to $85 in fuel alone. A 2-hour trip to a weekend destination and 2 hours back is $280 to $340 in fuel before you land. A real cross-country trip, say a 4-hour leg each way, is $550 to nearly $700 in fuel round trip. Now here is where the utilization question becomes really important, because fuel cost and utilization interact in a way that significantly affects how you should think about the per-hour cost of operating this airplane. If you buy the airplane planning to fly 150 hours a year, which is an amount that sounds entirely reasonable to a motivated, excited buyer at the point of purchase, your annual fuel cost at 10.5 gallons per hour and $7 per gallon comes out to just over $11,000 annually. That is a real number, but it is not unreasonable for someone flying 150 hours a year. The problem is that the average private airplane in the United States flies somewhere around 30 to 50 hours per year, according to most utilization surveys of owner-flown aircraft, and the Cirrus population, while probably higher than average given the investment level and buyer demographics, still sees a meaningful share of owners flying considerably less than their original intention. When utilization drops from 150 planned hours to 60 actual hours, your fuel cost drops with it, but your fixed costs do not. The loan payment does not care how many hours you flew. The hangar does not care. The insurance premium does not care. And suddenly the economics of the airplane look very different than they did in the spreadsheet at the time of purchase. Let us also talk about the database and subscription costs, because this is a category that surprises a lot of buyers, specifically because it does not fit neatly into any single line item in the purchase conversation. The Garmin panel in your SR20 runs on databases: navigation databases, obstacle databases, terrain databases, approach plate databases. These are not static files that you load once and use forever. They are updated on a subscription cycle, because the airspace changes, the approaches get amended, the obstacles get added, the GPS data gets refined. Keeping a Garmin Perspective or equivalent suite fully current on all required databases typically costs somewhere in the range of $700 to $1,200 annually, depending on exactly which subscriptions your installation requires and which ones you elect to maintain for specific capabilities. Some of that is mandatory for legal IFR currency. Some of it is optional, but practically essential for the way most Cirrus pilots actually use their airplane. Either way, it is a recurring annual cost that needs to go on the ledger. On top of the database subscriptions, most serious Cirrus owners end up carrying some kind of weather service subscription, whether that is through the XM weather receiver or a tablet-based service like ForeFlight. ForeFlight has become essentially standard equipment in the cockpit of every serious personal airplane being flown today, and a current ForeFlight subscription with the features that actually make a difference in real-world IFR and cross-country flying runs roughly $500 to $1,000 annually, depending on the tier you select. You can fly without it. You would not want to once you have used it, and almost nobody who owns a Cirrus is flying without something in this category. Add it up, and the annual database and subscription cost in a well-equipped SR20 operation comes to somewhere around $1,500 to $2,200 per year, or roughly $125 to $185 per month. Not a budget-breaking number on its own, but it does not stand alone. It sits on top of everything else. Now let us spend some real time on one of the most significant costs in SR20 ownership that almost nobody discusses honestly in the purchase process, which is the CAPS repack requirement. If you are buying a Cirrus and you do not know what CAPS is, start here. The Cirrus airframe parachute system is the whole airplane parachute that deploys via a handle in the cockpit and is designed to lower the entire aircraft to the ground at a survivable descent rate in the event that normal flight cannot be maintained. It is a genuine, real piece of safety equipment that has been used in actual emergencies with actual positive outcomes, and it is one of the genuinely distinguishing features of the Cirrus aircraft family. It is a meaningful part of why a lot of buyers choose a Cirrus, particularly buyers who may not have the instrument experience or the system's depth to handle certain in-flight emergencies through skill alone. The parachute is a real and valuable last resort, but the parachute is not a one-time installation. The CAPS system requires mandatory periodic repacking and inspection, analogous in concept to a skydiving parachute repack cycle, but for an entire aircraft system. The mandatory CAPS repack cycle on a Cirrus SR20 is every 10 years or at certain flight hours, whichever comes first. And the cost of a CAPS repack, performed by an authorized facility with the trained technicians and equipment to do it correctly, runs in the range of $1,500 to $3,000, depending on the specific model, the service center you use, and what is found during the inspection that may need to be addressed. Some owners have gone through repacks that came in toward the lower end of that range. Others have encountered issues with the harness, the deployment mechanism components, or the rocket motors that push the total cost significantly higher. Here is how this plays out in the purchase conversation. A buyer walks into the sales process for a used SR20. They find a beautifully maintained 2015 model with low time and a great logbook history. Somewhere in the pile of records there is documentation of when the CAPS was last packed. If the records show the last CAPS repack was 9.5 years ago, the buyer is looking at a CAPS repack obligation that is going to hit within months of taking ownership, and that obligation is not reflected anywhere in the asking price unless the buyer specifically identifies it and negotiates around it. In a straightforward purchase where neither the seller nor the buyer raises the CAPS timeline explicitly, a buyer can easily inherit a several $1,000 maintenance obligation they were not anticipating. On a new SR20, the CAPS repack is 10 years out from delivery, which is genuinely long enough that many buyers do not think about it at all during the purchase, but it is a real future liability that needs to be in the long-term budget picture. Beyond the repack cycle itself, there is a broader principle at work here that applies to the CAPS system and to Cirrus maintenance more generally, which is that this airplane has safety systems of a complexity that no other aircraft in its category carries. The CAPS is not a simple mechanical system. It involves rocket-propelled deployment mechanisms, a carefully engineered harness and canopy assembly, specific structural attachment points in the airframe that are engineered precisely for this application. Servicing and inspecting those systems correctly requires specialized training and authorization, which concentrates the service work at a smaller number of facilities than would be the case for a simpler airplane. And that concentration of service work into specialized facilities means less price competition and higher average labor rates for the work. This is not unique to CAPS. The broader electronics package in a Cirrus, the modern glass panel, the autopilot with envelope protection, the traffic systems, the ADS-B hardware, all of it is more complex than what you would find in a standard piston single, and complexity translates directly into maintenance cost when things need attention. The trade-off is real, and it can be argued either direction, but the cost reality needs to be in the picture. Let us now have an honest conversation about depreciation, because this is the cost that is hardest to see on a monthly basis and easiest to ignore until it is too late to do anything about it. A new Cirrus SR20 depreciates. Not catastrophically, not like a new car driven off the lot, but meaningfully, particularly in the first several years of ownership. The specific depreciation curve for a Cirrus varies based on market conditions, the overall supply of used Cirrus aircraft, broader economic conditions affecting demand for personal aircraft, and the specific year model and equipment of the airplane in question. But as a general framework, a new aircraft at this price point can lose somewhere in the range of 15 to 30% of its purchase price over the first 5 years of ownership, depending on those variables. On a $600,000 airplane, 15% depreciation over 5 years is $90,000. 30% is $180,000. That is a range of $18,000 to $36,000 per year in lost asset value, or $1,500 to $3,000 per month. Buyers who plan to own their SR20 forever, and there genuinely are Cirrus owners who hold their airplane for a decade or more and get real, sustained value from it, can make a reasonable argument that the depreciation question is less important than the pure ownership cost picture, because their exit strategy is flying the airplane rather than selling it. That is a legitimate position, but a meaningful share of SR20 buyers, particularly first-time Cirrus buyers who are buying into the airplane as an upgrade from something simpler, end up selling within 3 to 5 years as life changes, flying patterns change, or they step up to a higher capability aircraft. For those buyers, the depreciation is very real and very much part of the total cost calculation, and the calculation is not forgiving. Consider a buyer who spends $600,000 on a new SR20, puts $100,000 down, finances $400,000, and holds the airplane for 4 years before deciding to sell. At a conservative 15% total depreciation off the new price, the airplane is worth roughly $510,000. At a more aggressive 25% depreciation, it is worth $450,000. After 4 years of loan payments, the loan balance is somewhere around $380,000 depending on the interest rate and term structure. So the sale proceeds in the conservative scenario, after paying off the loan, are around $130,000, compared to the $100,000 down payment plus 4 years of loan principal paid. That math works out to something like breaking even, or marginally ahead in a good depreciation scenario. In a bad depreciation scenario, the numbers can invert in a way that is painful to actually calculate after the fact. None of this is unique to Cirrus. It is the reality of new aircraft ownership at this price point in a market with a robust used aircraft supply, but it is genuinely rarely discussed in the purchase process in a way that allows a buyer to make a fully informed decision about whether buying new versus gently used makes financial sense for their specific situation and time horizon. Speaking of which, let us talk about one more dimension of the ownership cost picture that tends to be significantly underestimated, which is pilot training and currency. Cirrus has built an entire training ecosystem around its aircraft, which is one of the things the company does genuinely well and which adds real value to ownership. The Cirrus Standardized Instructor Program, the training centers affiliated with Cirrus aircraft, the structured initial qualification, and recurrent training pathways, all of this is a real asset. It also represents a real, recurring financial commitment. Initial transition training for a new Cirrus owner, if they are coming from a different aircraft type or stepping into more capable avionics than they have previously operated, is typically a multi-day event at an approved training facility. The cost of initial Cirrus transition training at an authorized center runs from around $1,500 to $4,000, depending on the program structure, how many hours of dual instruction are included, whether simulator time is involved, and the specific provider. This is a one-time cost at acquisition, but it is a real one, and buyers who do not factor it into the purchase budget sometimes find it unwelcome. Recurrent training, on the other hand, is an ongoing cost that never goes away as long as you own the airplane. Most insurance policies on a Cirrus at this price point require annual or biennial recurrent training as a policy condition. Even if your specific policy does not require it, operating a complex, high-value aircraft with sophisticated avionics in real-world IFR conditions without annual recurrent training is genuinely inadvisable on the merits, separate from what the insurance policy says. The currency loss in the specific skills required for IFR operations, for using the autopilot effectively in unusual situations, for managing the CAP's decision-making under stress, is real and consequential, and the only way to counter it is regular, structured practice. Recurrent training at a Cirrus-affiliated center typically runs $2,000 to $4,000 for a full program, and if you are doing it annually, which you should be, that is $1,700 to $3,300 per month added to your recurring training budget. Beyond the formal recurrent training, there is also the ongoing cost of maintaining currency in a more basic sense. If you are not flying the airplane regularly, the currency in your instrument approaches, your crosswind landings, your instrument scan, degrades faster than most pilots appreciate, and re-establishing it means either flying the airplane specifically for currency purposes, which costs fuel and wear time, or going back to a flight school for dual instruction, which costs instructor time on top of fuel. The hidden cost of currency maintenance is one of those things that only becomes visible when you have actually been through it. But once you have gone a few months without flying and then sat down in a glass panel airplane in actual instrument conditions and felt how much you have lost, it becomes very real, very fast. So let us build out a complete picture of what SR20 ownership actually costs per month, being honest about the full picture rather than the partial one that most buyers are working from when they sign. Start with the loan service on a financed SR20. Call it $3,800 to $4,200 per month, depending on the exact loan amount and terms. Add insurance amortized monthly, somewhere in the range of $700 to $1,200. Add hangar rent. Call it $900 using our middle estimate. Add maintenance amortized monthly across a realistic annual maintenance spend, $400 to $550. Add fuel based on a realistic 50 to 60 hours of flying per year, rather than the optimistic figure most buyers plan for at purchase, which comes to around $400 to $500 per month. Add the database and subscription costs, call it $150 per month. Add training amortized monthly across a realistic annual training spend, around $250 to $300 per month. Add your CAPS repack reserve, call it $20 to $30 per month, to build toward that obligation over the 10-year cycle. Add all of that together and you get a total monthly cost of ownership somewhere in the range of $6,750 on the conservative end to $7,750 on the more realistic end. Some months will be lower. Some months will be higher, particularly when a significant maintenance item comes up, when training falls in that billing cycle, or when a scheduled CAPS repack or other major inspection hits. That is a range of $81,000 to $93,000 annually in direct out-of-pocket ownership cost, before you have accounted for depreciation. If you add conservative depreciation of around $18,000 annually, you are looking at somewhere between $99,000 and $111,000 per year in total economic cost of SR20 ownership on a financed, new airplane. If depreciation runs at the higher end of the range, call it $25,000 annually, you are at $106,000 to $118,000 per year. Now let us put that against utilization, because the number that really tells the story is cost per hour. If you fly 60 hours in a year, which is realistic for the average motivated private owner in this income bracket, your all-in cost per hour in that SR20 is somewhere around $1,600 to $2,000 per hour. Not per year, per hour. Every single hour you spend in that cockpit. If you fly 100 hours per year, which requires genuine discipline and planning and represents above-average utilization, your all-in cost per hour drops to roughly $1,000 to $1,100 per hour. Still a significant number. If you fly 150 hours, which is genuinely ambitious and sustainable, only with intentional structure around how and when you fly, the cost per hour comes down to around $700 to $800 per hour. Better, but understand that getting to 150 hours a year in a personally owned airplane requires a level of intentionality and available flying time that most working professionals with busy lives find hard to sustain over multi-year ownership periods. These are not numbers designed to scare you away from the airplane. They are numbers designed to help you decide whether this airplane or any airplane at this price point is the right financial decision for your specific situation. And the reason those numbers matter so much is that there are alternatives worth comparing them against honestly. A Cirrus Vision Jet fractional ownership entry-level share, to pick one comparison, will get you turbine speed and capability, a professional maintenance organization, and a much simpler administrative experience for a total annual cost that starts looking broadly comparable to full SR20 ownership once you are completely honest about the SR20 numbers. A well-maintained used SR22, which is the SR20's larger and faster sibling and which exists in the used market in meaningful supply at prices significantly below a new SR20, gives you more airplane for less total cost at the price of giving up the new warranty and some of the current spec equipment. A block card with a charter operator that you use for real business travel, and a simpler, cheaper airplane for the personal and recreational flying you actually do most often, can together serve a buyer's actual mission more efficiently than one expensive airplane that gets pressed into service for every trip, regardless of whether it is really the right tool. None of those comparisons is universally better than owning a new SR20. For some buyers, the SR20 is exactly the right airplane at exactly the right cost for their specific mission, their specific financial situation, their specific lifestyle, and they should buy it without apology. The parachute is real. The training ecosystem is real. The panel is excellent. The community is genuinely supportive and engaged. For those buyers, the numbers we just walked through are the honest cost of something they value deeply and use regularly, and the math works. But for a meaningful share of the buyers who actually purchased this airplane, those numbers represent a financial reality that was never fully assembled in one place before the ink was on the purchase agreement, and discovering it piece by piece over the first year or two of ownership is a painful and expensive education. The pre-purchase medical question was not asked clearly enough. The insurance conversation with the broker happened after the deposit was paid, rather than before. The maintenance reserve was based on what someone in a Facebook group said, rather than on actual shop invoices from actual Cirrus owners. The hangar search happened after closing and turned out to be harder and more expensive than expected. The utilization plan of 100 hours a year, quietly and gradually, became 40 hours a year as the initial enthusiasm met the reality of a busy calendar, and nobody adjusted the spreadsheet to show what 40 hours does to the per-hour cost. That is the hidden cost of owning a Cirrus SR20, not any single line item. Not one number that the dealer did not put on the sheet. It is the full picture, assembled completely, with realistic assumptions instead of optimistic ones, calculated against realistic utilization instead of planned utilization, and compared honestly against alternatives that might serve the same mission for less. So here is what the process should look like if you are actually considering this airplane or any airplane in this price bracket. Start the insurance conversation before you start the purchase conversation. Call an aviation insurance broker, not a general insurance agent who handles aircraft as a side business, a specialist, and give them your actual pilot certificate, your actual total time, your actual time and type if you have any, your actual recent instrument currency, and ask them to give you a real number for hull and liability on the specific airplane you are considering. Not a rough estimate, a real quote based on your real profile. That number is going to shape the rest of the financial picture significantly, and finding out it is $12,000 a year, rather than the $6,000 you estimated, is information you want before you fall in love with a specific airplane and serial number, not after. Then build your complete monthly budget using the framework we just walked through, starting with loan service at a rate that reflects current market rates rather than rates from 3 years ago, and using realistic utilization in the 50 to 80 hours per year range unless you have a specific, credible plan for flying more than that. Most buyers are not disciplined enough about this step, partly because the optimistic version of the utilization assumption makes the cost per hour look more manageable, and partly because nobody in the sales process is incentivized to push you toward a more conservative utilization assumption. Talk to actual SR20 owners, not just in online forums where selection bias toward the most enthusiastic owners is significant, but specifically owners who have been through a few years of real ownership and have real annual invoices in front of them. Ask them directly what their total annual cost has been. Ask them what surprised them. Ask them what they wish they had known before they bought. The aviation owner community can be genuinely generous with this kind of information when you ask honestly and specifically, and first-hand ownership cost experience is far more useful than any estimate. If you are buying used rather than new, which is worth serious consideration given the depreciation curve, pay specific attention to when the caps was last repacked, and factor the remaining time to the next required repack into your offer. Check the service bulletin compliance history carefully and understand which open bulletins apply to the specific serial number you are considering. Get the avionics logged and verified, because a glass panel with maintenance-deferred items that have not been addressed can generate significant near-term expense that should be reflected in the purchase price. And have a pre-purchase inspection done by a shop with genuine Cirrus experience, not just a general A&P who has looked at plenty of Cessnas and Pipers, but limited time with Cirrus-specific systems. If all of that process confirms that the numbers work for you and that the SR20 is genuinely the right airplane for your mission, your budget, your utilization reality, and your financial situation, then buy it with confidence. It is a genuinely exceptional airplane, and there are owners across the country flying them happily and well who have gone through exactly this kind of honest evaluation and landed on yes. The goal is not to talk anyone out of a Cirrus. The goal is to make sure that the yes, when it happens, is a fully informed yes rather than a partially informed one that leaves a buyer discovering the rest of the picture over the next 18 months of ownership. There is a broader principle underneath all of this that applies well beyond the Cirrus specifically, and it is worth naming explicitly before we close. General aviation aircraft at this price point are serious financial commitments, and the sales process for them is not always structured to ensure that buyers have complete information before committing. That is not necessarily bad faith on anyone's part. It is often just the natural dynamic of a sales conversation where the seller's incentive is to move the transaction forward and the buyer's enthusiasm is carrying them toward the thing they want rather than toward the full picture of what they are taking on. The result is a gap between what buyers expect and what ownership actually delivers financially, and that gap, when it eventually becomes clear, produces exactly the situation I described at the beginning of this video. An owner sitting with the full math for the first time, looking at an airplane they love, wondering why the picture they are looking at now looks so different from the one they were working from at the time of purchase.